The alarm clock buzzed at 5:30 a.m., just like it had every morning for the past 8 months. Agent David Chen rolled out of bed in his modest apartment in downtown Miami, looking nothing like the federal agent he truly was. His closet was filled with expensive suits and designer watches, all part of an elaborate disguise that had become his second skin. For 8 long months, David had been living a lie. To everyone around him, he was Danny Rodriguez, a successful property investor with money to burn and connections to spare. He drove a flashy red Ferrari, wore $1,000 shoes, and talked about real estate deals like they were his bread and butter. But underneath it all, he was gathering evidence against one of the most sophisticated criminal organizations the FBI had ever encountered. The Paradise Property Group looked perfect from the outside. Their glass office building gleamed in the Miami sunshine. Their website showed millions of dollars in successful deals, and their clients seemed to love them. But David knew the truth. This company was nothing more than a front for washing dirty money, and he was getting closer to proving it every single day. It all started when the FBI noticed something strange. Millions of dollars were flowing through Miami real estate deals, but the money trail led nowhere. Properties were being bought and sold at impossible speeds, often for prices that made no sense. A rundown warehouse would sell for $10 million one week, then get flipped for $2 million the next. It was like watching a magic trick, except the disappearing money was funding serious crimes. David remembered his first day at Paradise Property Group like it was yesterday. He had walked into their marble lobby wearing his best suit, carrying a briefcase full of fake documents that took the FBI tech team weeks to create. His story was simple but convincing. He was the investor from California who had made his fortune in tech stocks and wanted to diversify into Miami real estate. He had cash to spend and wasn't too worried about asking difficult questions. The company's owner, a smooth-talking man named Vincent Torres, had welcomed David with open arms. Torres was exactly what you'd expect from a high-end real estate boss. Expensive haircut, perfect teeth, and a handshake that could sell ice to an Eskimo. But David noticed things that others missed. The way Torres's eyes would dart around when discussing certain properties, how he always steered conversations away from specific financial details, the fact that half the company's biggest deals seemed to happen with buyers who never actually visited the properties. Over the months, David had slowly worked his way into the inner circle. He attended company parties at Torres's mansion, played golf with the senior partners, and even went on fishing trips with some of the biggest players in the organization. Every conversation was a careful dance. He had to seem interested and wealthy enough to be useful, but not so curious that he raised suspicions. The hardest part wasn't learning the real estate business or remembering his fake background story. It was watching crimes happen right in front of him and not being able to stop them immediately. David saw drug money get cleaned through property sales. He watched as stolen funds from insurance fraud were converted into legitimate-looking real estate investments. Every day he had to smile and nod while criminals discussed their next moves, all while a tiny recording device in his watch captured every word. His FBI handlers checked in with him twice a week through carefully arranged meetings that looked like casual encounters. Sometimes it was a jogger who stopped to tie his shoe near David's car, passing him a coded message about his next assignment. Other times it was a coffee shop worker who slipped him a note along with his morning latte. The Bureau was taking no chances with his safety, but they also needed him to stay deep undercover for as long as possible. The pressure was getting to him, though. 8 months of lying about everything from his name to his childhood memories was exhausting. David found himself sometimes forgetting which story he was supposed to tell to which person. He had notebooks hidden in his apartment where he wrote down every detail of his fake life, studying them like homework assignments. Danny Rodriguez from California liked seafood but was allergic to shellfish. He had a sister named Lisa who lived in Portland. His favorite football team was the 49ers. His first car was a blue Honda Civic. None of it was true, but it all had to be perfect. The breakthrough came during a casual conversation at a company barbecue. David was standing by the pool at Torres's house holding a beer and watching the sunset over Biscayne Bay, when one of the senior partners let something slip. The man had obviously had too much to drink, and he started talking about a big deal coming up. Not just any deal, but what he called the Golden Goose, a property transaction that would move more money in one day than most people see in a lifetime. David's heart started racing, but he kept his expression calm and interested. This was what the FBI had been waiting for. The big score that would give them enough evidence to bring down the entire organization. But he also knew that getting details about this deal would be dangerous. The closer he got to the real criminal activity, the more likely it was that someone would start asking questions about Danny Rodriguez that he couldn't answer. Over the next few weeks, David carefully gathered more information. The Golden Goose turned out to be a series of property purchases involving a new development project on the beach. On paper, it looked like a legitimate deal to build luxury condos. But David discovered that the buyers were shell companies connected to a drug cartel, and the inflated property values were a way to launder nearly $50 million in illegal profits. The plan was perfect from a criminal standpoint. Buy beachfront land at ridiculous prices using dirty money, then sell it back to legitimate developers at a loss. The cartel would take a financial hit, but their money would come out clean on the other side. Paradise Property Group would take a hefty commission for making it all look legal, and everyone would walk away rich and untouchable. David knew this was his chance to gather the evidence the FBI needed to shut down the operation permanently. But he also knew that one wrong move could blow his cover and put him in serious danger. The people he was dealing with weren't just white-collar criminals who would lawyer up and surrender quietly. They were connected to violent organizations that wouldn't hesitate to eliminate anyone who threatened their business. As he got ready for what he thought would be just another routine meeting at Paradise Property Group, David had no idea that his carefully constructed world was about to come crashing down. Tonight, everything would change. The restaurant was buzzing with the usual Tuesday evening crowd when David walked through the front doors of Ocean Prime, one of South Beach's most exclusive dining spots. The place screamed money with its white leather booths, crystal chandeliers, and walls lined with expensive artwork. David had eaten here dozens of times during his months undercover, always playing the part of Danny Rodriguez, the wealthy investor who belonged in places like this. Tonight felt different from the moment he stepped inside. The hostess, who usually greeted him with a warm smile and knew his preferred table, seemed nervous and barely made eye contact. She quickly led him to a private dining room in the back of the restaurant, claiming that Torres had specifically requested the more intimate setting for their business discussion. The private room was elegant, but felt oddly isolated from the rest of the restaurant. Thick walls muffled the sounds from the main dining area, and David noticed there was only one way in and out. Around the large mahogany table sat 6 men from Paradise Property Group, all wearing serious expressions that didn't match the celebration mood that Torres had promised when he called to invite David to this special dinner. Torres stood up as David entered, his usual charming smile looking forced and uncomfortable. The man who had welcomed David into the company with open arms 8 months ago now seemed to be studying his every move with suspicious eyes. The other men at the table included the company's head of security, a tough-looking former police officer named Rick Stone, and several senior partners who David had worked closely with on various deals. "Danny, great to see you," Torres said, shaking David's hand with what felt like unnecessary firmness. "We have some exciting news about the beachfront project we've been discussing. Sit down, let's talk business." David took his seat, immediately sensing the tension in the room. These men who had treated him like family for months now felt like strangers. Their body language was all wrong. Nobody was making the usual small talk about golf games or weekend plans. Instead, they were all watching him with the intensity of people who were expecting something to happen. The waiter brought drinks, but David noticed that while everyone else had ordered their usual cocktails, they weren't really drinking them. Glasses sat untouched on the table as the conversation started, with Torres explaining the final details of the beachfront development deal. On the surface, everything sounded normal. Property values, construction timelines, investor returns, but David could feel that something was seriously wrong. About 20 minutes into the dinner, Stone excused himself from the table, claiming he needed to make a phone call. David watched through the corner of his eye as the security chief stepped outside the private dining room, but stayed close to the door. The man's position blocked the only exit, and David realized with growing alarm that this wasn't a coincidence. Torres continued talking about the development project, but his words felt like they were coming from a script. The other men around the table were nodding along, but their attention was clearly focused on David rather than the business discussion. Someone's phone buzzed with a text message, and David saw several men exchange meaningful glances. "Danny," Torres said suddenly, his tone shifting from friendly to serious. "We need to discuss something important with you. Some concerns have come up about your background, and we need to clear the air before we move forward with this major investment." David's pulse quickened, but he kept his expression calm and confused. "Concerns? What kind of concerns?" "I've been completely transparent about my business and my interest in this project." One of the senior partners, a man named Williams, who David had known for months, leaned forward with a folder in his hands. "We hired a private investigator to do some additional background checks on all our major investors. Standard procedure for deals this size. But when we tried to verify some of the details about your business history in California, we ran into some interesting problems." The folder landed on the table in front of David with a soft thud that felt as loud as a gunshot in the quiet room. Inside were photocopies of documents, financial records, and what looked like surveillance photos. David's stomach dropped as he realized that his carefully constructed cover identity was being systematically torn apart in front of his eyes. "Your tech company, that supposedly made you rich enough to invest millions in Miami real estate," Williams continued. "We can't find any record of it ever existing. The business address you gave us is a mail forwarding service. The partners you mentioned have no online presence whatsoever. It's like Danny Rodriguez, the successful tech investor, is a ghost." Torres was watching David's face carefully, looking for any sign of panic or deception. "Now, we're reasonable people, Danny, or whoever you really are. There could be perfectly innocent explanations for all of this. Maybe you're trying to keep your business dealings private for tax reasons. Maybe you're hiding assets from an ex-wife. We've all had complicated financial situations." David felt sweat beginning to form on his forehead despite the air conditioning in the private dining room. His mind raced through possible responses, trying to find a way to salvage his cover story without making the situation worse. Every option seemed to lead to more questions that he couldn't answer without revealing the truth. "But here's what we can't ignore," Torres continued, his voice getting harder. "The timing of your arrival in Miami coincides exactly with when we started noticing some unusual interest in our business from federal authorities. Phone calls that sound different, clients asking more detailed questions than usual. The kind of attention that makes successful businessmen very nervous." Stone stepped back into the room at that moment, and David noticed that the former police officer was no longer alone. 2 other men had joined him, both looking like private security rather than restaurant staff. The message was clear without anyone saying a word. David was outnumbered, trapped in a room with no easy exit, and his cover was blown. "So here's what's going to happen," Torres said, standing up from his chair. "We're going to take a little ride to a more private location, where we can have a completely honest conversation about who you really are and what you're really doing in Miami. No pressure, no threats, just a friendly chat between business partners who need to clear up some misunderstandings." David knew that leaving this restaurant with these men would be a death sentence. Whatever they had planned for their private location, it wouldn't involve him walking away alive. But he also knew that resisting too obviously would confirm their suspicions and make the situation even more dangerous. "Look, I understand your concerns," David said, trying to keep his voice steady, "but I think there's been some kind of mistake. I'm happy to provide additional documentation about my business background. Maybe we could schedule another meeting tomorrow when I can bring my attorney and we can sort this all out properly." Torres shook his head with what looked like genuine disappointment. "I'm afraid that's not going to work, Danny, or whatever your real name is. See, the problem with trusting someone for 8 months is that when you find out they've been lying to you the whole time, it raises questions about everything else they might be planning." The men around the table were standing up now, and David realized that his time for talking was running out. Stone moved closer to his chair, and the 2 security men positioned themselves near the door. Whatever was about to happen next, David knew it wouldn't be good. "We're going to step outside now," Torres said quietly. Nice and calm, like old friends leaving after a pleasant dinner. No scenes, no drama. No reason for anyone in this restaurant to remember seeing anything unusual tonight. David felt his options disappearing with each passing second. His FBI backup team had no idea where he was or that his cover had been blown. His check-in wasn't scheduled for another 2 days. If he disappeared tonight, it might be weeks before anyone realized what had happened to Agent David Chen. As Stone reached for his arm to help him stand up, David knew he was running out of time to make a decision that could save his life. David stood up slowly from the table, his mind racing through every possible escape scenario he could think of. Stone's hand was already moving toward his arm, ready to guide him out of the restaurant with the kind of firm grip that would look friendly to observers, but feel like a vice to David. The two security men by the door were trying to look casual, but their positions blocked any chance of a quick exit. "Gentlemen, I think we're all overreacting here," David said, forcing a nervous laugh that he hoped sounded authentic. "I understand your concerns about my background, but taking me somewhere else to talk isn't necessary. We can handle this right here, right now. I'll call my business manager in California and have him send over all the documentation you need." Torres shook his head with the patience of a man who had already made up his mind. "Danny, we've moved past the point where phone calls and paperwork are going to solve this problem. Too many things don't add up, and in our business, when things don't add up, people get hurt. We need to know exactly who you are and what you want with Paradise Property Group." David felt Stone's fingers wrap around his upper arm, not quite painful but definitely not gentle. The message was clear without anyone having to say it out loud. This wasn't a request anymore. He was leaving this restaurant whether he wanted to or not, and his only choice was whether he made it difficult for everyone involved. As they moved toward the door of the private dining room, David's training kicked in. 8 months of deep cover work had taught him to think like a criminal, but underneath that fake identity, he was still a federal agent with years of tactical training. He started cataloging every detail that might help him survive the next few minutes. The restaurant was still busy with the dinner crowd, which could work in his favor if he could find a way to create enough of a scene to attract attention. But Torres and his team had obviously planned this carefully. They were moving him through a side corridor that avoided the main dining room, heading toward what looked like a service exit that would put them in the back alley behind the building. "Where exactly are we going?" David asked, trying to buy himself more time to think. "If we're just going to talk, why not use your office?" "Why the secrecy?" Williams, who was walking behind them, answered with a tone that tried to sound reassuring, but missed the mark completely. "We have a private meeting space that's more suitable for sensitive business discussions. Somewhere we can talk without worrying about being overheard or interrupted." David knew what that meant. They were taking him somewhere isolated where nobody would hear him scream, and nobody would find his body for a long time. The professional way they were handling this told him that Paradise Property Group had dealt with similar problems before. He was probably not the first person to get too close to their operation and disappear as a result. As they reached the service exit, David made one last attempt to change their minds. "Look, I know this seems suspicious, but I can explain everything. My business partner handles most of the paperwork side of our company. I'm more of the face-to-face guy. That's why the records might seem incomplete when you search for them." Stone pushed open the heavy metal door, and David felt the warm Miami evening air hit his face. The alley behind the restaurant was dimly lit and empty, except for a few dumpsters and a black SUV parked near the far end. The vehicle's engine was running, and David could see someone sitting in the driver's seat waiting for them. "Get in the car." "Danny," Torres said, all pretense of friendliness now completely gone from his voice. "We're going to have that honest conversation now, whether you want to or not." David's feet felt like they were made of lead as Stone guided him toward the SUV. Every step took him further away from safety and closer to what he knew would be a brutal interrogation, followed by his execution. These people had too much money and too much to lose to let a potential federal agent walk away with months of inside information about their operation. Halfway to the vehicle, David made his decision. He couldn't get into that SUV. Whatever happened next, his only chance of survival was to stay in public where there were witnesses and potential help. He stopped walking and pulled his arm free from Stone's grip. "I'm not getting in that car," he said loudly enough that his voice echoed off the alley walls. "If you want to talk, we can do it right here." Stone moved quickly to grab him again, this time with both hands and considerably more force. "You don't get to choose anymore, friend. You had 8 months to be honest with us, and you chose to lie instead. Now we do this our way." David tried to break free, but Stone was a former police officer who knew how to handle resistant suspects. The two security men moved in to help, and suddenly David found himself being physically forced toward the waiting vehicle by 3 men who were much more experienced at this kind of thing than he had hoped. "Help!" David shouted, hoping someone in the restaurant might hear him through the walls or that there might be other people in the nearby buildings. "Someone call the police!" His shouts echoed uselessly in the empty alley. Even if someone heard him, it would probably sound like a drunk guy causing trouble. Nothing worth getting involved in. Torres looked annoyed by the noise, but not particularly worried about being discovered. "Nobody's coming to help you." "Danny?" Torres said as the three men wrestled David closer to the SUV. "And even if someone called the police, we'll be long gone before they show up. This is Miami. Police response time in this neighborhood is about 15 minutes on a good day." David could see the open door of the black SUV getting closer with each step. Once they got him inside that vehicle, his fate would be sealed. He would disappear into the Miami night like so many other people who had crossed the wrong criminals, and the FBI would spend months trying to figure out what happened to their missing agent. The driver of the SUV had gotten out to help force David into the back seat. 4 men against 1 in a dark alley with no witnesses and no help coming. David realized that his only chance was to do something so unexpected and dramatic that it would completely change the situation before they could react. He stopped struggling against their grip and went completely limp, forcing them to support his full weight. The sudden change in resistance caught them off guard for just a moment, and in that moment, David made a decision that would either save his life or get him killed immediately. His right hand moved toward the inside pocket of his jacket, where he carried something that could change everything if he had the courage to use it. For 8 months, he had hidden his true identity so carefully that sometimes he almost forgot who he really was. But now, with his life hanging in the balance and no other options left, it was time for Danny Rodriguez, the fake investor, to disappear forever. Torres saw his hand moving toward his jacket pocket and shouted a warning to the others. "Watch his hands. He might be armed." Stone twisted David's arm behind his back, trying to prevent him from reaching whatever he was going for. But David was fighting for his life now, and desperation gave him strength he didn't know he had. With his free hand, he managed to reach into his jacket and grab hold of the one thing that could save him. The leather wallet felt familiar in his fingers, even though he had avoided touching it for months. Inside that wallet was his real identity, his real authority, and his only chance of surviving the next 60 seconds. As the 4 men struggled to force him into the SUV, David knew that everything was about to change in ways that none of them could imagine. Time seemed to slow down as David pulled the leather wallet from his jacket pocket. Stone was still twisting his arm, trying to prevent him from reaching whatever weapon they thought he might be carrying. Torres was shouting orders to the other men, telling them to get David into the SUV before he could cause any more problems. The driver had moved around to help, making it 4 against 1 in the dim alley behind the restaurant. But David wasn't reaching for a weapon. His fingers found the familiar weight of his federal credentials, the leather badge case that he had carried for over a decade, but hadn't dared to touch for 8 months. In one swift motion, he pulled the badge case free and held it high above his head where all 4 men could see it clearly. "Federal Bureau of Investigation," David shouted at the top of his lungs, his voice echoing off the alley walls with an authority that cut through the Miami night like a knife. "Release me immediately!" The effect was instantaneous and dramatic. Stone's grip on David's arm loosened as if he had suddenly grabbed hold of a live electrical wire. The former police officer stumbled backward, his face going pale as the reality of what he was seeing hit him like a physical blow. The badge case was open, revealing David's official FBI credentials and his real name. Special Agent David Chen. Torres's mouth fell open in shock, and for a moment he looked like a man who had just watched his entire world collapse around him. The smooth-talking businessman who always had an answer for everything was suddenly speechless, staring at the federal badge like it might be some kind of elaborate fake that would disappear if he looked at it long enough. "That's impossible," Torres whispered, but his voice lacked any real conviction. Deep down he knew it was real. All the pieces that hadn't quite fit together over the past 8 months suddenly made perfect sense. The investor who asked just the right questions. The newcomer who seemed to understand their business a little too well. The timing of David's arrival with increased federal attention on their operation. The 2 security men who had been helping to force David toward the SUV now stood frozen like statues, suddenly aware that they had just attempted to kidnap a federal law enforcement officer. Their faces showed the same mixture of shock and terror that was spreading through the group like a contagious disease. David kept his badge held high, making sure it was visible not just to the 4 men, but to anyone else who might be watching from the surrounding buildings. His training had taught him that in a situation like this, Visibility and witnesses were his best protection against retaliation. "You are all under arrest," David announced, his voice now carrying the full authority of his federal position. "Conspiracy to commit money laundering, attempted kidnapping of a federal officer, and about 50 other charges that my colleagues at the Bureau are going to enjoy explaining to you in detail." The driver of the SUV was the first to break from the group, turning and running toward the mouth of the alley without saying a word. David made no attempt to stop him. Let him run. The FBI had been watching Paradise Property Group for months, and they knew exactly who all the players were. There was nowhere any of these men could go that federal agents wouldn't find them. Stone, his police training finally overcoming his shock, raised his hands in a gesture of surrender. "Agent Chen, I had no idea. We thought you were. We didn't know you were federal law enforcement. This is all a misunderstanding." David almost laughed at the absurdity of calling an attempted kidnapping a misunderstanding, but he kept his expression serious and professional. "The only misunderstanding here is that you thought you could operate a criminal enterprise under federal surveillance without consequences." Torres was still staring at the badge, his mind obviously racing through the implications of what this meant for him and his organization. 8 months of federal surveillance. 8 months of recorded conversations. 8 months of David gathering evidence about every aspect of their money laundering operation. "How long?" Torres asked quietly. "How long have you been watching us?" David smiled for the first time since leaving the restaurant. "Long enough to know about the beachfront development deal. Long enough to know about your connections to the cartel money. Long enough to know about every property transaction you've used to wash dirty cash for the past 2 years." As if on cue, the sound of sirens began echoing through the Miami streets, getting closer with each passing second. David had managed to activate his emergency beacon while struggling with his captors, and FBI response teams were already mobilizing across the city. Within minutes, this quiet alley would be swarming with federal agents executing arrest warrants that had been prepared months ago. Williams, who had been silent since David revealed his badge, finally spoke up with the desperation of a man watching his life savings disappear. "We can make a deal. We can cooperate. We can tell you everything about our suppliers, our clients, everyone we've ever worked with." David shook his head. "You should have thought about cooperation 8 months ago when I first walked into your office. Too late for deals now. The Bureau has everything it needs to shut down your operation permanently." The sirens were getting louder, and David could see the flashing lights beginning to reflect off the walls at the far end of the alley. Stone looked like he was considering making a run for it, but David's steady gaze made it clear that attempting to flee would only make things worse for him. "Federal agents, get on the ground." The shout came from the mouth of the alley as a tactical team in full gear swept into the narrow space behind the restaurant. Red laser dots from their weapons danced across the chests of Torres and his men, making it very clear that resistance would be futile and dangerous. David held his badge high so the tactical team could identify him clearly. "Agent Chen, FBI. These 4 men attempted to kidnap me after discovering my undercover status. The situation is secure." Torres, Stone, Williams, and the remaining security man all dropped to their knees with their hands behind their heads, following the shouted commands of the tactical team. The transformation was complete. 8 months ago, these men had welcomed David into their organization as a valuable business partner. Now they were face down in a Miami alley, zip-tied and under arrest for federal crimes that would put them in prison for decades. As more FBI vehicles arrived and agents began securing the scene, David finally allowed himself to breathe normally for the first time in hours. His cover was blown, his undercover operation was over, but he was alive and the criminals were in custody. More importantly, the evidence he had gathered over 8 months of careful work would be enough to dismantle the entire Paradise Property Group money laundering network. Special Agent Rebecca Martinez, David's handler, appeared at his side as the tactical team finished securing the prisoners. "You okay, Chen? When your beacon activated, we thought you might be in serious trouble." David looked at the 4 men being loaded into FBI vehicles and smiled. "Nothing I couldn't handle. But I think it's time for Danny Rodriguez to retire. Agent David Chen has some arrests to make and some trials to prepare for." The alley that had nearly become David's grave was now a crime scene buzzing with federal agents, forensic technicians and prosecutors who were already planning the cases that would put Paradise Property Group out of business forever. 8 months of living a lie had finally paid off, and justice was about to be served. The FBI field office in Miami had never seen anything quite like the operation that unfolded over the next 72 hours. Within minutes of David's dramatic reveal in the alley, federal agents were executing search warrants across the city. The Paradise Property Group's gleaming office building was sealed off as evidence teams carried out computers, file cabinets, and boxes of documents that would take months to analyze completely. David sat in a debriefing room on the 15th floor of the federal building, still wearing the expensive suit that had been part of his Danny Rodriguez disguise. For the first time in 8 months, he was allowed to be himself again. No fake accent, no made-up stories about tech investments, no careful monitoring of every word he said. The relief was overwhelming. Special Agent Martinez sat across from him with a legal pad covered in notes, trying to capture every detail of the undercover operation while it was still fresh in David's memory. "Walk me through the beachfront development deal one more time," she said. "We need to make sure we understand exactly how they were planning to move the cartel money." David rubbed his eyes, exhausted but energized by the knowledge that his months of work had finally paid off. Torres had it set up perfectly. Shell companies connected to the cartel would buy beachfront property at inflated prices, sometimes 2 or 3 times what the land was actually worth. The sellers were all connected to Paradise Property Group through various partnerships and holding companies. He pulled out a notebook that had been hidden in his apartment, filled with details he had carefully recorded during his time undercover. Every conversation, every suspicious transaction, every mention of illegal activity had been documented with the precision of a federal agent who knew his notes might someday be evidence in court. The genius of their system was the second part of the transaction, David continued. 6 months later, the same properties would be sold to legitimate developers at or below market value. The cartel would take a loss on paper, but their dirty money would come out clean on the other side. Paradise Property Group would collect commissions on both ends of the deal, making millions in fees for providing what was essentially a money-washing service. Martinez nodded as she wrote, already thinking about how this information would play in federal court, and the total amount they were processing. Conservative estimate, $50 to $70 million per year, going back at least 3 years. We're talking about enough money to fund serious criminal organizations, drug trafficking, human smuggling, you name it. Every dollar that Paradise Property Group cleaned was a dollar that could be used to hurt innocent people. Down the hall, other FBI agents were conducting similar debriefings with the arrested Paradise Property Group employees. Torres, Stone, Williams, and the others were learning firsthand what it meant to be on the wrong side of a federal investigation. Their expensive lawyers were already making phone calls, trying to arrange plea deals in exchange for cooperation, but the evidence David had gathered made their positions nearly hopeless. The ripple effects of the operation were spreading far beyond Miami. FBI field offices in Los Angeles, New York, and Houston were executing related search warrants as agents followed the money trail to other cities, where Paradise Property Group had business connections. What had started as a local money laundering investigation was turning into a multi-state operation that would impact criminal organizations across the country. David's phone buzzed with a text message from his real estate contact at the bureau. The beachfront properties that were supposed to be part of the cartel's next big money-washing operation had been seized by federal authorities. $50 million in criminal assets were now in government custody, money that would never make it back to the drug dealers and human traffickers who had been counting on it. "The media is starting to pick up the story," Martinez said, showing David her phone. "Local news is reporting on the arrests, but they don't have the details yet. We'll need to be careful about what information gets released publicly while the investigation is ongoing." David nodded, already thinking about the next phase of the operation. Arrests were just the beginning. Now came months of building federal cases, preparing for trials, and working with prosecutors to make sure every criminal involved in the Paradise Property Group network faced justice for their crimes. Agent Rodriguez, David's backup contact during the undercover operation, knocked on the door and entered with a satisfied smile on his face. "Thought you'd want to know the latest numbers. We've arrested 16 people so far, seized over $200 million in assets, and we're just getting started. The U.S. Attorney's Office is already talking about this being one of the biggest money laundering takedowns in federal history." The success of the operation was gratifying, But David also felt a strange sense of loss. For 8 months he had lived a completely different life. Danny Rodriguez had been a character, but he had also been David's reality for longer than many people stay at their jobs. The expensive suits, the flashy car, the lies that had become second nature. All of that was over now, and David found himself missing some aspects of the role he had played. What happens to the Danny Rodriguez identity? David asked Martinez. The apartment, the car, all the props we use for the operation. Standard procedure is to dismantle everything and return all bureau property, she replied. The Ferrari gets sold at government auction, the apartment lease gets terminated, and Danny Rodriguez disappears forever. You'll go back to being Special Agent David Chen, probably with a commendation and a promotion for exceptional work under dangerous circumstances. David smiled at the thought of returning to his normal life, but he also knew that normal would feel strange after months of living on the edge. Undercover work was addictive in its own way. The constant danger, the intellectual challenge of maintaining a false identity, the satisfaction of gathering evidence against people who thought they were untouchable, it was unlike any other kind of police work. Over the next several weeks, the full scope of the Paradise Property Group's criminal activities became clear. David's undercover work had uncovered connections to drug cartels in Mexico, human trafficking networks in Central America, and corruption schemes involving local government officials who had been paid to look the other way while illegal money flowed through Miami real estate deals. The trials that followed were a prosecutor's dream. David's months of careful evidence gathering had created an airtight case against everyone involved in the money laundering operation. Recorded conversations, financial documents, and David's first-hand testimony painted a picture of systematic criminal activity that defense attorneys found impossible to challenge effectively. Torres received a 25-year federal prison sentence. Stone got 15 years. Williams and the other senior partners each received sentences ranging from 10 to 20 years. The message was clear. The federal government would not tolerate criminal organizations using legitimate businesses to wash dirty money, and anyone caught doing so would face the full consequences of their actions. For David, the success of the Paradise Property Group operation led to new opportunities within the FBI. His skill at undercover work and his ability to gather evidence in dangerous situations made him a valuable asset for other complex investigations. Within 6 months, he was already preparing for his next assignment, another long-term undercover operation, targeting a different criminal organization in a different city. But he never forgot the night in the Miami alley when everything could have gone wrong. The moment when he pulled out his federal credentials and watched 4 dangerous criminals realize that they had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. It was a reminder that law enforcement work could change in an instant, and that sometimes the difference between life and death was nothing more than a leather badge case and the courage to use it at exactly the right moment. The Paradise Property Group building still stood, empty months later, its windows dark and its marble lobby gathering dust. But the criminal organization that had once operated there was gone forever, and the dirty money that had flowed through Miami real estate deals was no longer funding violence and corruption. For Agent David Chen, that was worth 8 months of living a lie and one terrifying night when his cover was blown.